Okay, today we're going to talk about resolving ethical issues and competence, which is how the ethics code starts. So the first component of the ethics code that addresses how to kind of look at ethical issues talks about the misuse of psychologists' work, and you can insert, counselors' work or therapists' work here. Um, so this is referring to when you, as a clinician, create something and then someone else misinterprets it. And there are a lot of ways that this can happen. I think the most common, though, is when your notes or a report or any kind of professional work is sent to someone else and that person interprets it incorrectly. So maybe you send a report to another clinician, maybe you send a report to a lawyer or a judge, and it gets misinterpreted. So that's one way that this can happen. And when that happens, or if that happens, you have the responsibility to try and correct it. They talk about in the ethics code, which hopefully you've read, about extraordinary access. You do what a reasonable person would do to try to correct it. And sometimes, it's not possible. The professor who taught me ethics when I was in graduate school, he was a psychologist in Edmond, and he was often called by Oklahoma City News to kind of give his input when there was something involving mental health. So when there had been, a really high publicity crime or some new legislation involving mental health, they would call him and he would kind of give some perspective. I'm sure you guys have seen therapists and psychologists on the news, whenever there's a mass shooting or whenever there's a celebrity who dies with some mental health issues or something like that. Anyway, so they would call him, and often along the bottom of the screen, it would say his name, and then it would say, comma, psychiatrist, right? And he's not a psychiatrist, he's a psychologist. And you guys probably know just in general that as a society, those two terms are often used interchangeably, and they shouldn't be, right? A psychiatrist is a medical doctor. They go to medical school, and their specialty is in psychiatry. A psychologist has a PhD, and their specialty is in therapy usually, or research. So they would say his name and then say psychiatrist. And so he would call and tell them, hey, I'm not a psychiatrist, right? But it's already aired, because he wouldn't know until later when he watched the report, because you don't see what's on the little ticker below you when you're speaking, right? So he just documented that he had called and tried to correct it. They're not going to take up news time to say, oh, by the way, last night we had this guy on, he's not a psychiatrist, he's a psychologist. They're not going to take up time to do that, but he did his part to try to correct it, and that's what you need to do. So same thing goes if your court testimony gets misinterpreted, if your presentations get misinterpreted, anything that you become aware of and you believe that it's not an accurate representation of your work, you make an attempt to correct it and you document that. There are times when the ethical code contradicts the law. The most common example of this has to do with confidentiality. So a client has the right to expect you to keep your mouth shut regarding what they tell you. And there sometimes are situations where the law system, the Department of Justice or whatever, wants you to break that confidentiality. So maybe you're seeing a kid and then the parents get divorced and they want you to testify in some type of custody hearing. Well, technically what that child told you or what the parents told you as a therapist is confidential, right? If they don't meet the criteria for breaking confidentiality, which we'll talk about in a later lecture, then you have the responsibility on the outset to keep confidentiality with your client. So what first will happen is that you will likely get a subpoena from a lawyer, either the district attorney or the lawyer representing the parents or whatever the situation is. And you have the right to refuse to give your records. You do not have the right to not respond to the subpoena. So first round, they send you a subpoena, you have to respond, first in writing or call back or whatever and say, that's actually protected under confidentiality. So you have that right. However, if they press it and they get the judge to do a court order for your records and you do not then turn them over, you can be held in contempt of court, which is illegal, and you can potentially have a fine or jail time. So then we're falling into kind of the realm of civil disobedience. At what point do you give in, right? And say, well, it's not worth me going to jail, which is probably the case. So at that point, you can give in and you document, that you tried and you sent this letter and blah, 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 and you didn't, just automatically hand over your stuff. The ethics code does have language about how you are not expected to go above and beyond as far as actually putting yourself in prison for not handing over records. So you should try to abide by the ethics code. If the two conflict, you are allowed to follow the law because no one's expecting you to, risk your freedom. But you can be careful about what you send. So maybe you try sending just a summary first, or you try sending just a copy of your testing report. There are things you should never send, and we'll talk about that later as far as test protocols and things like that, copyrighted material. But the reason that you have liability insurance as a clinician is for situations like this. I've never had a subpoena, but my husband has had a few. And the first thing you should do is call your liability insurance. They have lawyers on retainer to talk to you about the legal process. And that is what you pay them for. You pay them every month for liability insurance so that they can guide you through these things. And then you can document that you have been acting under the advice of a, ethics liability, the lawyer they have on retainer. So call them, have them help you, document what they tell you, and they will walk you through that process. But that's the most common example of when ethics and law contradict each other. The other things that may come into play are HIPAA, how you protect your notes and things like that. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about confidentiality. Now, there also might be conflicts between the ethics code and the organization where you work. So maybe the school you work for or the insurance company that works with your agency, they might have different rules than what the ethics code says. Schools are tricky because schools don't operate under HIPAA, they operate under FERPA. And FERPA is educational law. Educational records are considered a little bit less confidential, I guess, than HIPAA rules or HIPAA records are. So schools operate under what's called a need to know situation. So let's say a child is acting out and gets evaluated. And in the report that the school psychologist does or that the outside psychologist does, it talks about some trauma that this child has had, which would be an important, component of the report if we're looking at, behavioral disorders. So the child has trauma and, the report gets pretty specific about, let's say this child was sexually abused. Well, that report sits in the child's educational record. So it is in there with the special education documents, for example, to get that child some special education services and behavioral support. Well, who has access to that is under FERPA, what is called need to know. So who needs to know this child's history? And it is not the entire school, right? It should not be just general information that everybody knows. The special education teacher likely needs to know, potentially the general education teacher if the child is spending significant time with that teacher. Other teachers don't need to know. Other school personnel don't need to know. So schools are kind of their own, they have their own system of dealing with records, and some handle it better than others. I have personally seen teachers just kind of, flippantly discuss these things with each other, and they shouldn't. It should be protected. But when you are an outside clinician doing educational or psychoeducational evaluations for schools, you kind of have one foot on both sides as far as HIPAA and FERPA. And I would just, you only have so much control, right? I often contract with schools to do testing for them. And once I hand over the report to them, I don't have any control over what they do with it, right? But if you're employed by the school, then you do have a little bit more say. And it's just important to try your very best to protect the privacy of the people that you test and evaluate. Hospitals, again, who has access to your health information when you're in a hospital system? Quite a few people do. The nurses see it, the doctors see it, the insurance companies might see it. And so sometimes there are some tricky situations with who gets to see what. Correctional systems for sure. If it is court ordered therapy or court ordered, let's say anger management, you need to tell the client that this is not confidential. This is going right back to the court system, and that's important for them to know. And it would be an example of breaking confidentiality. But as long as you're clear with that and your informed consent, then you've done your due diligence as far as that goes. With insurance companies, you cannot bill without diagnosing. When you go to enter any billing for any insurance company, including Medicaid, Medicare, you have to put in a diagnosis code. So you've known this person a half hour, it doesn't matter, you have to diagnose them. And that insurance company then has access to that person's mental health diagnosis. And that can be kind of scary, I think, when you start thinking about the implications of whether or not they can then serve in the armed forces, whether or not they can ever purchase a gun, right? I think as a society, most people agree that quote unquote crazy people should not own guns. But what constitutes crazy? Because are you crazy if you've been depressed? Because if you've ever gone to therapy, even if it's for grief or for, let's say you're just adjusting to a divorce or whatever, that therapist has to diagnose you with something in order for the insurance companies to pay for your services. And if we get into a place where we don't feel like we can go seek mental health services because it's going to infringe on our freedom because we've been labeled as having a mental health issue, then we come into some problems. And that is kind of the big picture issue with how insurance companies deal with mental health. But just be aware that anytime a person is in therapy, they have to have a diagnosis in order for insurance to pay. So if you become aware of an ethical issue with another professional, before you do anything else, you should talk to the individual. So it is your responsibility as a clinician to bring it to the attention of the other clinician. Maybe they don't know, maybe they're unaware of how things are being perceived, or let's say you share an office with someone and they left out someone's mental health record. Before you would file a complaint or anything really crazy, it would be your job to talk to the other clinician first and say, hey, I'm just letting you know that you left this out and I saw it and other people could have seen it too, and all of that. If a person discloses to you that another clinician has broken the ethics code, let's say you're seeing someone in therapy and they tell you that the therapist they had previously, that they had a sexual relationship with them. Well, that is definitely an infringement of the ethics code. And at that point, you have to decide, is it worth breaking the confidentiality of your client to confront the other clinician? Because that person, that client told you that in confidentiality, they have an expectation of privacy. You really should not break confidentiality at that point to confront the other individual. You can encourage them to file a complaint, but you have to be very careful about saying, hey, I know what you did with this person, because you don't have the right to break confidentiality in that situation. You also need to consider the credibility of the accusation. There are certain types of clients who will make up things, and that can be an issue, of course. And then what is the level of harm? Now, if we're talking about someone, let's say it's a child and their previous clinician, assaulted them, that is then a certain level of harm this person could be perpetrating on multiple children, and that would then bring it to the level of significant enough harm to where you can consider breaking confidentiality. Again, though, I would always go to your ethics, professional liability insurance, and have them walk you through this, because that is what you pay them for, and you can document that you then went through their services. If the harm is substantial and you've tried talking to the person if appropriate and it didn't work, then you can go ahead and make a complaint. Again, though, if it compromises confidentiality, that is not okay unless there is a serious harm. Someone's going to get murdered or something. And we'll talk it later in the semester about the situations in which you have to break confidentiality as a mandated reporter. But if it does not rise to that standard, then you do not get to break confidentiality to make a report. And that is very difficult. I've had clients tell me about things that have happened with other clinicians that are ethical issues. And I have not been able to confront the person or make a complaint to the ethics board because it would be breaking confidentiality. And that is a very tough situation to be in as a clinician. So it's not easy, but it is more important that that client feels safe with you and can trust that you will not break their trust. Now, one very unfortunate thing about how the ethics violations work is that when you are filling out, for example, your liability insurance questionnaire every year to get your insurance updated, they ask if you've ever been brought before the ethics board. And that does not mean that you're guilty. It means that someone has accused you, but it does not mean that you're guilty and you have not gotten to go through due process. But your rates can still go up even for being accused, even if you're not found to be guilty. We've had people apply for jobs at ECU that when you Google them, an ethics complaint comes up, and it is very difficult to not take that into consideration when you're hiring someone, even if they aren't found guilty. It's just human nature that we take those things seriously. And we've seen many examples of this just in the news recently, of people, and being accused is as good as being guilty. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be that way. We should have, full due process, but someone accuses you and yeah, people believe them. And that's just how it goes, unfortunately. So we should not, the ethics code will tell you to not use unfair discrimination against complainants or respondents, which means that you do not take those things as fact when they have not been proven. But, it is very difficult to kind of overcome that because as a society, we want to believe victims, and we should, for the most part, but that doesn't mean that no one has ever been malicious and made a complaint that is not true. All right, let's talk about competence. So one thing that makes me very nervous is when I talk to clinicians, especially master's level clinicians, LPCs, and they tell me they see, ages 3 to 99. They see everybody, any condition, any age, and that's scary because there is no way that in 60 hours of graduate school you come out equipped to deal with anything that walks through your door. I did 5 years of graduate school, and I do not see everyone. I'm trained to see children. I don't even see every type of child. There are children who have come through my doors that I am not competent to see. So an example of this, I was doing my postdoc in Norman. I had a child who came in. His mother brought him in because he was having trouble adjusting to his parents' divorce. That I can deal with, right? I can deal with anxiety and depression and, kind of life events like that. So I'm seeing him in therapy. He's having some, attention issues at school as a result of kind of the chaos at home. And we're kind of working through some strategies to help him manage stress. As the time went on with this client, he starts to disclose to me that he's also dealing with some gender identity issues and some sexuality issues. He was in, I believe, 8th grade at the time. So that is not an area that I have a ton of competence in. Okay, I have not received formal training in human sexuality issues, especially in adolescence, when they're also dealing with puberty and all of those things together. So at that point, we had to have a discussion about him finding a clinician who was better suited, who had had more training in how to cope with that. So even though I have my PhD and I am a doctor and all of those things, it does not mean that I am equipped to deal with everything. It does not make you less of a clinician or, less um, of a good counselor to recognize that you are not equipped to deal with anything. And that actually makes, in my view, it makes you better to recognize that. So it might be that you're not equipped to deal. I have no training in dementia, for example, right? I was trained to work with kids, and so I am not trained to work with dementia. Um, so, and that's okay. That's fine. So it might be that you need to stay in your lane regarding age. It might be that you need to stay in your lane regarding type of condition. Maybe you have no training in schizophrenia. Maybe you have no training in childhood depression, and that's fine. Level of training. So, maybe you had a one chapter in your psychopathology class 10 years ago. That does not equip you, right? So you need to demonstrate competence by seeking out opportunities to refresh yourself, to make sure that you are up to date in those types of issues, those types of treatment. Now, there are situations when, I'm going to come back, but there are situations when there is an emergency and you are the most qualified person. One of my favorite examples of this was when I was in graduate school. I was in a school psychology program. I was being trained by school psychologists, of course, and there was a situation. Most of our classes were at night, much like yours, and there was a situation where there was a night class. It ended at, I think, 9:40, and right after the class ended, the police came to my professor, who was a school psychologist, and said, we have a student, an OSU student, on the roof of the parking structure who's threatening to jump. So, um, so my professor, who actually her specialty was in childhood autism, so she worked with real little ones, toddlers, early intervention strategies for people with autism, was asked to come to the roof of this parking structure and work with this individual. He was, in his early 20s, who was suicidal. So that was not her area, right? That was not her area of expertise. However, she was the most qualified person in the building at the time because she had more training than the night janitor. She had more training than the police officer in mental health. So she was called upon to try to diffuse that situation, and she did that successfully. However, she was not then going to take that person on as a client forever because that was not her area of expertise. So there's a difference between crisis response and long-term care. So in an emergency, yes. So you are the one-stop shop in your small town for everything, and a person comes to you and they are, let's say they're suicidal, and you do not feel equipped to deal with this person long term, you can still see them for a couple of sessions while you try to find them someone else, while you refer out. That is acceptable. It is not acceptable to say, well, they don't want to drive 20 minutes, so I'm just going to see them for years if you are not trained to work with them. So, and especially in this day and age when we have so many options as far as technology, you can find them someone else if you're not trained. This is to protect you and to protect the client. It protects you because let's say things go wrong and they sue you and you can't prove that you had any training to deal with them. That could, that could end up meaning you lose your job, you lose your license. It also protects the community because we should not be willy-nilly with people's mental health, right? If you're not equipped to deal, then you find someone who is. So we should only work with clients within our training and supervised experience. If you're not competent with a situation that has come through your door, you can seek out training by finding someone who has dealt with this before and have them supervise you. You don't teach what you don't know. So you should not be helping someone else if you are not trained, right? The ethics code talks about closely related training. And so this comes up a lot with assessment. So there's no way that you will be trained in every single assessment protocol out there, right? Like even IQ tests, there's 4 or 5 major IQ tests. You won't learn all of them in your intellectual assessment class. But if you've learned a few of them, you can do all of them because they're very similar in how they are done, right? But you should still make reasonable efforts to obtain competence when a new, okay, for example, the um, WJ, the Woodcock Johnson, which is a very, you know, mainstream cognitive assessment IQ test. It came out with a new version, the WJ4, about 5 years ago. And when it came out, the publishers, Riverside, put out all kinds of webinars to help clinicians who had been used to giving the WJ3 become familiar with the WJ4. And then they're free, they're online, they're an hour long. It just kind of shows you the updates. And then they give you a certificate so that you can show that you have obtained competence in the WJ4. That way, if you give the WJ4 and that report ever comes under scrutiny, you can say, no, I've been trained. I did this and this and this. I did the class in graduate school. I've taken the update, the continuing education classes to show that I am competent in this. The same thing with the DSM-5. I went to graduate school during the DSM-4. When the DSM-5 came out, I took advantage of all the opportunities for training in the DSM-5 so that I can diagnose DSM-5 codes and show competence if it ever comes up. After graduate school, it is your responsibility to maintain your competence through continuing education, through consultation with your peers, and making sure that you are up to date in current treatment. When I was in graduate school, when I was doing my postdoc, one of the psychologists at the office where I worked was this very, very old man. I mean, he is in his 80s, and he was straight Freudian. So my license number for the state of Oklahoma is 1275. So I am the 1,275th psychologist to get licensed in the state of Oklahoma. His license number was 11. He was the 11th psychologist to ever get licensed in Oklahoma in the 60s, or 50s or whatever they started. So he was a Freudian through and through, and he had some really crazy ways of talking about clients whenever we would do monthly meetings. Just very, he would talk about the Oedipus complex, and he would talk about all of these things that are kind of gone out of vogue, right? We don't really conceptualize things that way anymore. And he would also want to see clients daily, which, insurance doesn't really cover that anymore. I mean, there was just a lot to it. But he came under some scrutiny towards the end of his career, unfortunately, because he was using outdated assessments. He was using outdated methods. And it's really important to stay on top of that if you're going to maintain competence, to make sure, that your licensing board will require usually about 25 hours a year of continuing education, including 3 hours of ethics every year, to make sure that you are on top of changes in the field, because it's important to protect the community that you are up to date on those things. We don't get to just make up things as we go along when it comes to treatment. The ethics code talks about using evidence-based models, scientific judgment, and this is super important. We protect the community best when we use methods that have been shown to work, and not just, well, this is convenient for me as a clinician. I want to show you this website. This is for working with children. But there are all kinds of, similar websites out there for adults too. So this is the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare. And you can look up by program or by topic area. Let's say you want to look at anxiety treatments for children. So you go to anxiety treatments. Here's the key. So you really want a program that is a scientific rating of 1 or 2, preferably 1. Sometimes there aren't any 1s, but 1 is well supported, 2 is supported, 3 is promising. So here's all of the programs, and it will tell you what their rating is. So there is one program with a scientific rating of 1. It is called the Coping Cat. By the way, the Coping Cat is awesome. I've used it a lot with kids who are anxious, and you can click on it. It will show you the ages that it's good for. It'll tell you how to get trained in order to do it, and it's very minimal in this situation. They have the DVDs for you. You can find them. This actually is on Amazon as well. And then really importantly, it shows you the research. So there's been more than 10 in order for it to get that rating of 1. But here are all the different studies, and you guys have access to ECU's library. You can look these studies up and look at how these were done to find um, some really good research on what you're recommending to clients or what you're doing with clients. Let me show you what it looks like when it's just promising. Promising means that here are all of these different, let's look at play therapy, all of these different methods that have some research, but not enough. It could be that they are new, right? When there's something new, of course, it's not going to be well supported because there hasn't been time for there to be enough research, right? It takes a couple of years for those things to happen. But often it is that it's just really not that great. So, it's just important to be aware of what you're kind of giving to clients and make sure that it's your responsibility, not theirs, to make sure that you're being evidence-based in your judgment. When you are ill-equipped to deal with a client, it is your responsibility to find someone else. Now, this might be that you have a multiple relationship issue, a dual relationship. Let's say they are your sister's friend, or they are your ex's, cousin, or whatever. If it is something that is going to hinder your ability to see them clearly, to see them objectively, then you need to find them someone else. Now, it will likely be impossible for you if you are in a small town to have no affiliation with these people. So I practice in Ardmore. I'm not from here, so I don't know people here. But my husband grew up here and his family has been in Ardmore for a long time, and there are a lot of them around town. So very often someone will say, "Oh, I went to school with your brother-in-law," or, "Oh, I know your husband's grandma," or whatever. And that's fine because that is, yes, it is technically a dual relationship because they are my client and they grew up with my brother-in-law, but it does not hinder my ability to see them clearly because I don't know them in any other capacity besides being my client. Now, if they were in my small group at church and I knew all kinds of intimate details about them before they came into my office to do therapy, that is a problem. Or if I have some kind of emotional investment, let's say they're coming to me with a divorce situation and I know their ex, and I'm friends with their ex. Well, I can't be objective in that situation. So you try to find them someone else. You take reasonable steps and you document the fact that I'm not the best person for them for the following reasons. And it may take a few weeks, but I'm going to try to find them someone else. And then lastly, for this lecture, this will come up multiple times this semester, but it's really important that you do not take on clients who are not good for you. You don't initiate services with someone or some situation that's going to be hard for you. You don't persist in it once you realize that there is an issue, and you don't risk your own health for the sake of a client. So let's say you've had experience with domestic abuse, right? Domestic violence. And someone comes to you with a presenting problem like they've recently lost a parent and they're having trouble with bereavement and grief. Okay, that's great. But the further that you get into the treatment with them and you know that you get to know them, you realize there's also some domestic violence situations going on. And that's a trigger for you. And you're having a hard time not crying on the way home every day because it's bringing up memories for you. You don't need to persist in that, right? You can find them someone else who can be more clear headed, and you can do yourself a favor by not letting it affect your ability to work with others, because you are only as good as your best self, right? You can't be fair and be present to other people if you're dealing with your own issues. Situation that came up for me with this was when I worked in Dallas at Dallas Public Schools before I moved to Oklahoma. and I worked in a middle school, and I had an 8th grader who was pregnant, and she was considering abortion, right? Aborting her baby. Well, at the time, I was 6 months pregnant with my first child. So we're in a situation here where I am likely making her uncomfortable because I am obviously pregnant. She's considering ending her pregnancy. I'm uncomfortable because I'm talking about abortion while getting kicked, right, by a baby. I also have, I am pro-life. So even if I wasn't pregnant, it would have been difficult for me to advise someone to get an abortion just because of my own value system. But also, being pregnant made it difficult for her to be totally honest with me because it was so awkward for her, right? So I had to refer out. There was just no way that I could be objective in that situation. And also it was affecting my well-being, and that's okay. It does not make you a weak person to recognize that. In fact, it makes you better to know your limit. um, Once I became a mother, it was very difficult for me to do therapy all day every day with kids who are going through trauma. I was able to compartmentalize it better before having children. Right now I have 6 kids in my house, 7 and under, and I'm pretty spent emotionally anyway. I can't handle 6 clients a day of abuse and neglect and all of that. Later in my career, I might be able to, but right now I can't. And I know that. And it's better for my clients and it's better for me and my family to not try to persist in something that's not healthy for me. So right now I'm just doing assessment because I can delve into it and I can let it go with assessment. I write the report, I hand it to the parents, and I'm done. Even if it is a trauma situation, that is my role right now, is to help them conceptualize the problem, connect them with people who can treat them, and move on. And that's where I'm at in my life right now, and that's fine. And I can do that and I can do it well. 10 years from now, maybe I'll go back into therapy full time, and that's fine. Because at that point, if I'm able to handle it, I'll do it. My husband does it full time and he's fine. So yeah, just be aware that you are only going to be able to help others if you are in a good place. And so maybe you need to go to therapy yourself. That's fine. I had a I had a student in class my first year at ECU who was going through a rough divorce, and she was trying to get her LPC. And she said in class, "I don't think I'm going to be able to have any male clients because I hate men." Okay, if you are in a situation where you are going to alienate half of the human population because of your own issues, you need to not be doing therapy, right? You need to deal with yourself first, deal with your own issues, and then help others. It's kind of like the airplane situation where you put your mask on and then you help the kid next to you. You can't do that child next to you any favors if you've already passed out, right? It's not selfish. It's just how you take care of yourself and how you take care of those around you. So, um, self-care is super important. Mental health is a really draining job, and it's your responsibility to make sure you're on top of your game. So whether that means you cut back on clients, whether that means you don't see certain types of clients, maybe it means you take time to meditate or do yoga or pray or whatever, but you got to take care of you before you can take care of others. And that's part of competence. It's a really important part of being a good clinician. So that's all I've got for that for today. I appreciate you guys listening, and I hope you all have a great week.